through chapters 8 and 9. Now, it was only a relatively little time ago that people started realizing that different devices have different sized screens. The iPhone 6 has a different size screen from the Android Pixel, has a different size screen from the Windows PC, has a different size screen from the Apple Macintosh. Right? So, but everybody should be able to browse the web, and so the idea of the web page being responsive to the size of the screen came about. And it's the same actually as even when you resize the screen, right? We would like to be able to change the size of the screen and still have the text readable, right? And you can see this is reasonably responsive even when I make it quite narrow, and that's the sort of thing you might see on a narrow or a small phone's screen. So that's where the idea of responsive design is about. Here's an example. You've got the same website, but you've got 4 different views on the website showing different because of the different sizes of the screens and also the orientation, right? These two have a portrait layout, whereas these two have a landscape layout. It's always a good idea to at least start your design from mobile first. It's always harder because most computers, desktop computers or laptops, have a much bigger screen and usually a landscape sized screen or oriented screen than a portrait oriented screen. It's usually better to do the design for the mobile first and then figure out how it needs to change for other devices. And the perennial refrain from software engineers for a long time is, it works on my machine. Just because it works on your machine doesn't mean it works on everybody's machine. And it takes quite a bit of practice to do that right. So the things you should keep in mind when designing mobile first is the layout, right? The content should stack on top of each other rather than sit side by side. The media the screens don't necessarily have enough space for large high resolution images. I can remember, and it's better now, but I was developing for some relatively high end Samsung Android phones, and they couldn't take the images we were trying to use as backgrounds because they were too big. The phones were very fast, they had a good processor, but they didn't have much memory. And so our app kept crashing when we used some of the images that our graphic designers were giving us. Fonts are important. Try and use the system font. Small fonts are unreadable on small screens. Don't try and download fonts if you can possibly avoid it. Because if somebody's on mobile and they're in a 1-bar situation away from Wi-Fi, then that could be bad. Try and think about how navigation is going to work. The usual thing these days is to have the hamburger. There's the hamburger up there in the top left of this screen, right? and then what happens when you hit the hamburger. In this case, it opens up our table of contents. How are we going to interact with the website? I always say I have fat fingers because I mistype stuff on some smaller phone screens or some smaller websites. So make sure you think about how the user's going to interact with the website via mobile. And then content for some websites, you may want to adjust it, right? So you can just use an icon for mobile phones, or just put the telephone number for a desktop display. One way we make things responsive is by using a viewport as one of the meta commands, right? And here's an example of a meta viewport command in the HTML header, right? You should include that tag in all of your responsive pages. And I think one of the next things I'm going to do is I'm going to make you do an HTML template that includes all of the stuff that I'm looking for in the Super U assignment and some more stuff based on the idea of responsive design. Now with CSS we can actually do effectively a query. We can say if the screen is a minimum width of 768 pixels, then use these settings. So we can use different CSS for different screen sizes, and that sort of makes sense, right? You might want to use a bigger font on smaller screens, maybe. I don't know, just so that it's readable. And there's various other things, right? You can do screens between particular pixel values, or what their orientation is, etc. You do need to put the full rules inside the media query's body. You can't just put a property because the browser won't know what elements to apply it to. Right, so you need to have selectors and sizes and properties and that sort of thing. Just like all other CSS rules, the last one wins. All right, so you've got to make sure that you understand the ordering of your rules and the ordering of your CSS files. If you use multiple CSS files, you've got to make sure you understand the ordering of those CSS files. I'm not going to talk through all of this. We talked briefly about the flexbox last chapter, and here's another example where we've got divs and we're going to do something different around them. Right, so the first thing is for 768 pixels or wider, for the row class, we're going to say the display is flex, and for each column class item, it's going to we're going to make the columns grow equally. Okay, you can add other media queries depending on how things pan out, right? So here's a another thing that for the columns, they take up 50% of the parent by default, and we're using wrap, so extra items go to the next line. Then for larger screens, we just automatically size columns based on their content. Okay, that was chapter on responsive CSS. I'm going to be even briefer with chapter 9 CSS frameworks. Think about a framework as a library of CSS, and there are some good libraries of CSS that you can use that mean you don't have to do as much work. The nice thing is they make pretty beautiful pieces of HTML, or at least make HTML look beautiful, and in a specific way that is configurable to your palette and your sizes and all that. Right? The main ones you could look at are Bootstrap, sometimes called Twitter Bootstrap because it was originally created at Twitter but it was released as open source in 2011. There's Foundation, which is another library. Material Components for the Web is an official implementation of Google's Material Design visual language, and so Google products and Android applications look and feel like that. There's Materialize, and then the last one that we should really think about is a thing called Normalize.css. And it's not, Normalize.css is not really a full framework. It doesn't do much, except it just makes sure everything acts consistently across browsers. So it's great to be for the first thing to be included as far as your CSS is concerned, is for you to include Normalize.css. And that way everything gets reset, and your web page should then work the same in lots of different browsers without any foibles. And then you can start doing your design after you've included Normalize.css. Remember, last wins, so whatever you include after Normalize will alter the way it works. Right, the way you use a framework is you just link it in. Right, there's the one for Bootstrap, and there's the one for your CSS file. That's okay. That you can include as many CSS files as you like. Just remember, don't put that one first, because the Bootstrap one will clobber it. So you want to put yours after everybody else's. Just a note on that min.css. Some CSS files get pretty big, and if you format them so that they're human readable, they may be even bigger. So what some people do is they release their version of the CSS file, but then they release a minified version, which has all of the white space and comments removed, and it can be a lot smaller. Right, so Bootstrap goes from 160 kilobytes to 127 kilobytes. So just be aware of that .min.css. We'll also see that in JavaScript files as well. A lot of these frameworks are available on CDNs, Content Delivery Networks. That's good. That means you can link to them, and they don't use your bandwidth, and they're usually available a lot faster, because those CDNs, their aim in life is to deliver content as fast as possible. CDNs also allow your browser to do browser caching. So if the browser has already downloaded the CSS file, it's not going to bother getting it again unless you tell it to. right? So it's going to keep the local copy and it's not going to go out and hit the network again. That's a way to install Bootstrap if that's what you're using. You could grab it locally that way. That's just saying that this path has to exist if you want to use it. I'm not going to go through some of these features of Bootstrap, except to say that some of the changes to the standard are quite pretty, right? So the normal button is square and grey and boring, whereas you can make a primary coloured button. It's got nice rounded corners, and it's a nicer colour and all that good stuff. I think that's all I wanted to say about it, except to say that Bootstrap also lets you deal with responsive design a little better, right? They're a bit more granular in terms of what they think of as different size screens, right? So extra small devices, small, medium, large, and extra large, which is kind of nice if you want to make everybody's experience good, going from the smallest screen device all the way up to the stonking great desktops. Again, I'm not going to go through the details of this. I will talk to these once we start using them a little bit later. Just be careful. Some of these frameworks include JavaScript. And unfortunately, when we start using JavaScript frameworks, those CSS JavaScript included in CSS frameworks don't play nice with the JavaScript framework, such as React. So you have to be very specifically using React Bootstrap instead of the standard Bootstrap, because it re-implements JavaScript to work better with the React framework. Anyway, that's Chapter 8. Chapter 9, I think I'm done for CSS, and we'll move on to JavaScript.